How worried should we be about the virus? Among the new worries, the international community is also monitoring China to see how the coronavirus affects the world's second largest economy. Beijing has indeed adopted a series of robust policies to both control the epidemic and inject vitality into the economy. Yet observers at home and abroad are wondering what impact will the outbreak have on the global economy itself. What countermeasures should be taken to tackle those challenges? And once the virus slows, what should we expect of China's economic recovery? To talk about these and more, I'm happy to talk via satellite with Liang Hong, Chief Economist at the China International Capital Cooperation. From Shanghai, Professor Qian Jun, Executive Dean of the Fanhai International School of Finance at Fudan University. And from Rome, Michele Garazzi, the former Undersecretary of State of the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So according to a February report by China International Capital Cooperation, the epidemic's impact on the economy is only temporary. My first question is to you, Liang Hong. What is your take on the conclusion, considering the fact that this epidemic is still evolving rapidly?
Yes, because if we look at the history in the past 70, 80 years, all such epidemic outbreak tends to be temporary. The damage to the economy lasts about 1 quarter to 2 quarters. And this particular outbreak looks very similar to SARS. And if we look at its trajectory, even just for the past 15 days, it looks like the newly confirmed cases, the growth rate of that started to decelerate. So our base case scenario, if we look at the progression of how the newly confirmed cases have been evolving, it looks like the worst damage to the economy will last about a quarter and mostly felt in February and March.
But it seems that people and also the businessmen have responded very scarily to this. In the first trading day of the Shanghai Stock Exchange, it plummeted by 8%. The prices of oil, iron ore, and all the metals have dropped sharply. And actually, manufacturing services, it came to a halt. You don't worry this can linger for a longer time, Liang Hong?
Well, I think it's natural to be worried, but if you talk about the stock market, it did correct by 8% or more on Monday, but Tuesday, Wednesday, even today, we have seen a fairly strong rally. Investors start to come back to pick some of the names they like because they understand such impact tend to be short-lived, even though for those who have been affected, it's terrible, and some of them will suffer quite a lot of losses. But if we talk about overall, for a lot of the listed companies, this tend to be a 1 quarter, 2 quarter shock.
And Qian Jun, what is your assessment of the short-term and long-term impact on Chinese economy?
No matter the rebound starting in the second quarter or even later, as long as this thing is under control, economic activities will come back very quickly. And one thing I feel particularly, I feel better now than in 2003, was that if you look at the Chinese economy, consumption has now become the #1 leading force to pull the economy out of any sort of temporary concern. And in terms of consumption, a lot of the consumption activities have now switched online. And actually, in the first quarter, it's usually not the most important quarter for the year. So again, the data for the first quarter will probably look bad. But as soon as economic activities resume, as we've already seen that a lot of consumption now has moved to online, the effect will indeed be temporary.
But as you said, even though a lot of consumption has moved online, the service sector has been hit hard. And the government also worries about that because those service sector employees are not coming back to work. And you simply cannot ask the economy to come back alive without people, can you?
In the service sector, for restaurants, for example, they are particularly hard hit because people are not going to the restaurants, right?
No.
But at the same time, we've already seen that these online companies, they're actually, as I said, consumption-wise, they're picking up the slack in terms of ordering food. And also what they're doing is they are helping restaurants and other places to deliver food. So this, I mean, the important thing is don't underestimate what I would call the market mechanism in making up the losses and in this structural shift. So yes, there are a lot of small and medium enterprises do need help, and help is on the way. But on the other hand, a very strong market economy itself has a lot of mechanisms to make up the loss going forward.
And Liang Hong, governments on the local level and central governments has also promised some policies for enterprises and businesses. For example, injecting liquidity into the market, releasing taxes and funding on those small and medium-sized enterprises. Are those good enough? How helpful can they be?
Can I actually add one more point to your previous question? A lot of people said that the service sector now is a larger part of the economy. Actually, if we compare 2019 vis-a-vis 2003, service sector is now 12 percentage points bigger than back then. However, actually, if you look at the catering, tourism, transportation, their share has not increased. The 12 percentage point increase mostly come from online activities and telecom and financial services, which all of them can be even conducting even at a time like this. So this is, again, when people talk about service, they think about the low-end catering, labor-intensive services, but actually what has driven China's economy and the structural changes in the past 17 years has been mostly a lot of this tech, telecom, and online related activities.
And those areas wouldn't be that vulnerable, you are saying?
Actually, they're booming. So if you look at the past couple of days in the equity market, where investors are chasing are a lot of like online education, online entertainment, online medical services. So again, just for example, in China's retail services, back then, 2003, there's zero share coming from online. But right now, e-commerce is 26% of China's retail sales. So that tells you how much the structure of the economy has changed. But coming back to your questions about government policy response, I think the first most important policy response was coming on Monday. The central bank has started to provide liquidity to the market and to a lot of the companies. So the credit line has not been cut or suspended. And at the moment, we're seeing very targeted reliefs to logistics sector, to some of this labor-intensive, small, medium-sized companies. A lot of tax reliefs, rent forgiveness, and actually we're also expecting later on they could consider more like wage bill related kind of tax relief, because for some of this sector, even though for the broader GDP they don't look like that significant, but they do employ a lot of people. And to support employment and to stabilize consumption, I think more targeted tax relief could be considered as the virus disease being under control.
And let's talk a little bit about the epicenter of this epidemic. That's Wuhan and Hubei. Now, basically, 50 million people are in lockdown in Hubei. And how important is Hubei for the whole national economy? Because we understand a lot of manufacturing value chains are there. What are the ripple effects of that? Liang Hong first.
So if you just look at the share, Hubei is about 4.3% of China's GDP, and it's about 1.3% of China's total exports. It looks relatively small compared with back into SARS time. China has we have 10 provinces under the quarantine area identified by WHO. And if you look at Hubei's major industry, tech, auto, and steel, some of the heavy industry are significant. But those, again, there are other provinces that have overcapacity in the similar industries. However, of course, I think given how integrated the Chinese economy is with the rest of the world, but within China as well, the supply chain effect, if the outbreak cannot be controlled, contained quickly, the supply side, some of the stress will start to show.
Talking about the stress on the rest of the world, Mr. Geraci, how do you think the rest of the world should be worried about what is happening to China? And according to Singapore's Minister for Trade and Technology, Chan Chong-sing, he said it is a good lesson for everybody to look at the supply chain resilience. And also, formerly U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross said that this is actually a good time for America, because a lot of jobs, manufacturing jobs, might come back to the U.S. Despite the fact that this remarks may be inappropriate and bad timing. But is it a worry that people will move away from China because of exposure to the value chain here, Mr. Geraci?
I hope not. I think in the short term there will be hit, and maybe some of the most flexible industries could find other locations to continue the production or to compensate for the lack of production in China. But these tend to be generally light industries. You cannot move a factory to other countries in Southeast Asia, and less so in the United States. The basic assumption behind, I think, the statements were that this epidemic would last for a long period of time, which we hope, of course, that this is not going to be the case. But under, let's say, an optimistic scenario that this thing will completely die out in the next few weeks, hopefully, then I don't think there will be the shift that they predict. Having said that, I think there will be a hit on the Chinese economy. There were mention of the market reaction. However, this alone I don't think will be sufficient. And this is where the Chinese government can play the trump card, because we know that the Chinese economy has a large proportion coming from investment. Chinese economy can inject money into the system and can help the private sector to compensate. So the view here, my view here, is that there will be hit in the short term. Probably for the whole 2020, on aggregate at macro level, there could be compensating factor in the second half, but within this aggregate, let's say, not so dramatic picture, there would be industries that are hit. For example, in Italy, we are very much worried about inbound tourism from China, fashion, luxury goods purchases, because of course, if for a few months we do not have the flow of tourists coming from China to Italy, that cannot be compensated in the second half. Restaurants, people cannot eat twice in the second half because they didn't eat enough in the first half of the year. So there are natural sectors that cannot be immediately compensated, and this is one of the worries that we have. In terms of value chain, I think this will be a wake-up call, because we've always been talking about possible decoupling between the western and the eastern part of the economy. I think this will be a lesson for the world how hard the coupling would be. Even Italy, that sells, for example, a lot of auto parts to the German sector, German auto cars, and then sells them and makes them in China. I think this will be also a hit, because the value chain is now complex and so integrated that this will not be easy to disentangle. So I am hopefully we are talking without knowing the input, and the input is really how serious the disease is, and we all hope it's not going to be so serious, of course.
You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. We've been talking about the economic impact of the novel coronavirus. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this. As we have been discussing the economic impact of the novel coronavirus on Chinese economy and the world, As you just mentioned, the Chinese consumers played a very important, probably increasingly important role for world economy. For example, since 2014, China is the largest source of tourism expenditures and also high-value luxury goods. And do you think the Chinese people will come back to consume when the epidemic is over? And to what extent it can make up for the losses that we are currently suffering now?
If 2003 SARS episode was a reference, the whole epidemic back then lasted until June. And the national holiday in October, we see overseas tourism rebounding with 11–13% kind of increase. So I would expect the same. So as long as people start to feel safe to travel around, we do see pent-up demand to actually for the second half of the year or early next year, we should see the rebound coming back.
And the Chinese government now has been practicing stringent control measures on people's movement. Do you think that measures will ease up later on? Because mostly the cases are concentrated in Hubei, while the rest of the country begin to thaw up.
The market is closely watching every day the growth rate of the newly confirmed cases. Since last weekend, we are seeing this growth rate decelerate. And the coming weekend will be a critical point. People will be watching whether that growth rate will start to get towards zero. The absolute number of newly confirmed cases each day should stop rising first. Then that means that all the quarantine measures, policy response started to work. And if such policy do work around the end of this month, early next month, if we start to see the absolute daily addition of newly confirmed cases getting into below 100, let's say maybe 10, a couple of the cases still are there, I think that's when a lot of economic activities will start to resume. That's a similar pattern as during the SARS period. So it's when the time the first lockdown, the nationwide lockdown happens, it took about 4 weeks for the cases started to decelerate very fast. Then economic activity, particularly industrial activities, start to recover. And consumption, consumer activity, particularly tourism, usually recover with a further delay, like a couple more months after that.
But the government has to consider the worst scenario. What do you think the policies the government should keep in stock in case the worst comes?
I think, again, they would have to be worried whether we need a longer lockdown, and they are working very hard to come up with medical remedy because the disease so far still has no cure and there's no vaccine. So they are preparing for if this, the nation, whether it needs to have longer lockdown, and also the medical services, whether some of the remedy can come up quickly. And in that case, we have also seen some of the trial of new medicine being expedited, and with cooperation even with some of the American companies.
I want to talk about another international ramification of this epidemic. That's racism and xenophobia. Mr. Garassi, on February the 2nd, a young Chinese Italian took to the streets in Florence, where he lives, and he was wearing a face mask, and he put up a placard saying, "I'm not a virus, I'm a human being, eradicate prejudice." And actually, a lot of Chinese nationals have run into prejudices and even racism slurs all over the world because what happened in China. What do you think is happening, and what can we do about it?
I mean, these are all regretful events, of course. I have watched the video of the young Chinese man in Florence, and this has been extremely popular in Italy and has helped a lot. People have been moved, and you have seen the reaction of many passers-by hugging him. So, as you know, Italian, Chinese people, we are very similar in culture, family-oriented. we do tend to go beyond the macro issue, and then the person-to-person interaction is very warm, as I myself have witnessed while living in China. I've been very much welcome. I think people tend to be scared because, of course, in the media we all look at these trends of the curve, like the colleague was saying. We look at the growth rates. We get scared when we see 24,000 people hit. We get scared when we see the lockdown in Wuhan. So people tend to not know, and it's the unknown that gets fear. And I think this is why the Italian government, maybe they didn't communicate well, but they took some measures to, for example, try to quarantine all people coming from China. But this is not for Chinese people, it's for everyone. In fact, the only people who have now been quarantined are the Italians that moved from Wuhan. They went back to Italy a couple of days ago. And these are Italian nationals that have been locked for 2 weeks to do tests. So all the measures that we take are not tailored at Chinese people specifically, but anyone who may have been exposed. And this has been following the example of what the Chinese government has done in Hubei and in Wuhan. And we're doing a campaign. If I may, I want to show you a new hashtag that I've just launched a few days ago. I think this is what I'm doing in Italy, because I think this is the kind of solidarity that we want to bring to people in Wuhan, because I think the more, even words beyond medicine can help bridge this gap. And I'm personally taking time off from my other activity to just communicate to my Italian people that we need to be warmer to the Chinese, to the students. We have children. We have lots of second-generation Chinese from Wenzhou, mostly they live in Italy. Yesterday, Mr. Salvini, that normally is accused of being anti-migrant, has given a very warm message to the Chinese community in Italy, praising them for being hard-working people, respecting the law, and it is one of the community in Italy that is most respected because they produce wealth for the country. So even top government people, the former vice premier, has given this warm message. And I think once people listen to his message, this signal is cascading down to the society, and things can be more relaxed. But again, information will smooth down things. But there is in no way anything against Chinese people per se. It's only some fear about anyone who comes from China. Even I, when I go to meeting, people ask me, Michele, have you been to Wuhan recently? This is Italian to Italian, so it's not based on the passport.
So Qianjun, so basically, when an outbreak is young, people are in panic, and it's understandable that some people react over the top. But when people are better informed and when it's more stable, this will go away. Is that the case?
Absolutely. You know, what we've seen is that as we gain more knowledge, right? Because this new event is bad. It has a lot of new phenomenon, but you know, actually we learn a lot more about the virus very quickly. And as you gain more knowledge, I think the fear, as been mentioned, the fear is the unknown. If you don't know how fast, how deadly this disease is, that brings out the most fear. I mean, we've seen a lot of data continuously and very transparently, very quickly. As you've seen a lot more data, as you look back in history, right? Because a lot of people were saying, oh, this is going to be much worse than SARS in 2003. But as you actually look at the data, because the rebound was so furious in the third and fourth quarter, statistically, it wasn't clear there was any negative impact on that year's Chinese GDP. So this is something I keep telling people.
What do you think the Chinese healthcare industry do in the future after this?
If you look at the medical system, it's not like they don't have enough stock. The problem is, again, due to uncertainty in the earlier stages of this event, people are very concerned. And people without the clear diagnosis symptoms of this virus also went to the hospital. So in some sense, you know, this is kind of like a bank run. This is like a run on the hospital system. That made a lot of stress on the medical system. So there's a lot to be learned from this, that how the medical system, how the healthcare industry should better prepare for a sudden event like this. Maybe there should be enough stock. The other thing that's very interesting, very important, I think, is that from the producers and from the supply chain, we've now just watched reports that some manufacturing firms are now converted into making face masks. We need that. We need enough production capacity that can be easily converted into producing medical supplies in time of need. So there are a lot of things we can learn from this and to be better prepared. But on the other hand, I think as long as more information, more correct, accurate information comes out about the disease, about the treatments, about the data, about the evolution of this event, people, I actually feel, you know, if you just watch at home, I think today, this week, overall, I can feel the general sentiment is a lot calmer than last week or 2 weeks.
Last words, Liang Hong, what do you think it means
as people learn from,
for China's hospitals and healthcare industry in general?
I think this is, again, interesting to see China's urbanization process is still advancing. And China probably at the 10 years from now will have 15 to 20 megacities that will have more than 10 million residents. How would you deal with public health and how much, like for example, how many hospital beds and how many doctors we should have in mega cities like that? I think that will be also, once the outbreak is under control, the Chinese government, the policymakers, and the whole medical community would start to think about. I agree with Professor Chen Xun. This, some of the early stages you have, like a bank run, a big run on the hospital system, but if we look at the actual numbers, a lot of these mega cities, the public health service were not equipped to deal with a city that actually have a residence more than 10 million or 20 million. A lot of the equipments were built for whatever residents with hukou rather than the actual residents there.
All right. Hopefully we can learn a good lesson from what happened. Thank you very much, Liang Hong, Chen Jun, and Michelle Garassi. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zhou in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.